Okay.
That's recording. Now it's recording.
Remote. Mr. Chris.
Thank you. Plug it on my card. Thank you.
Oh. E cioè ieri sera, quindi sto male. No, ho detto, non c'era quello. Cioè, ma Cavaglio ho detto, senti, vieni qua, se mi vedevi. Vabbè, vai. Oh, questo è un po' gentile. Oh, poi si capisce tutto quello che dice. Anche mi tagliare. Poi si vede ancora un po'.
È un puntino.
Senti.
Chiamo un attimo Sorrento.
Sì.
Vorrei parlare con te. Sono qua fuori.
Is anybody coming on after?
Eh?
Is anybody, after I finish, is somebody coming out? Is there something else on here at 10:15? No, not
Ah, when you finish.
When I finish.
Okay, I just no, I think nobody. No, we don't have a amethyst. 11:50 and 20 max because come for the excursion.
Right. Okay, so there's plenty of time.
Yes, yes. Right. Are you in front?
I just stopped there
Ah, okay.
with Eloisa. She's coming. I'll sit down.
Okay. It's 10 o'clock, we better start on time. I'm sure there's another 100 or so out there trying to get here on time, but we'll go with what we've got. I hate to disappoint the English, but yesterday we had about 90 to 100 French people here for the same lecture. So tomorrow when we do another one, hopefully we'll rally the English troops and have a more equal battle. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Vikings. Before I do that, I think I wanted to put both them and the crews in a little bit of perspective. Norway's not a country that's well known to a lot of people, but it is fairly distinctive. And when you say Norway, most people think fjords, of course, and they then think of Vikings. But it's an extraordinary country. It's about 1,200 miles from top to bottom. And it has a very long frontier with Sweden, a very short frontier with Finland, and an even shorter frontier with Russia. So it's got some very interesting neighbours, not all of whom have been very friendly over the years, especially the Swedes. Most of the country is mountainous. The long spine of mountains that runs parallel with the border all the way up it's quite high. There are about 20 or 30 peaks over 2,500 meters. The only part of the country that has any flat area is down in the south around Oslo. The rest is nearly all mountainous. Even the Bulge on the south is a large wall at a very high altitude, the Hardangervidda. So the population of Norway clings around the coast, and this characterises the Norwegians very, very strongly. They're a coastal seafaring nation by and large. It has glaciers, the peaks are snow peaks for the main part, and I understand there's still snow on them even at the moment. It also has thousands of islands. The coastline from top to bottom is about, with all the irregularities, is about 25,000 kilometres. If you measure all the island coastlines, it has a total coastal area of about 80,000 kilometres, which is massive. And of course you'll see the islands. They're mostly unoccupied, and there are some that are quite large, but a lot of them are very, very tiny. The odd Norwegian has built a summer house on it. Christ knows what he does when he's in it, but they're not normally occupied. So that's the territory we're talking about. The first point we make about the Vikings is that you think of Vikings as being a group of people. If they are, but they're not defined by their nationality, they're not a tribe, they're not a clan or anything like that. Viking is an activity. It's the thing that they did. They went raiding. Viking in Old Norse means raiding by sea. So anybody could be a Viking. You could have been Vikings. I could have been a Viking. But these guys who lived down in the south of Norway were obviously the progenitors of it. They were essentially pirates. And they did their craft of pirating for one reason: to make money. They did it violently, they were incredibly aggressive, they had all the tools of the trade to do it, as we'll see, and they were successful. If you think there's a similarity between the Vikings of old and the Somali pirates of today, it would be very close. They're essentially doing the same thing for the same reason. Another misconception is we think of the Vikings as being Norwegians. They were, but they were also Danes, and they were also Swedes. Vikings existed in all the Scandinavian countries. They were fundamentally the young people, or younger people, because the older Vikings, A, couldn't do it anymore, and B, somebody had to look after the farm back at home, raise the families. So Vikings, by and large, were youngsters. I'm sure there were some old Vikings, but it was a young man's job. Very physical. You had to have some stamina to row the boats for long distances. So that's the thing. Oh, sorry, one other misconception is that Vikings were tall and blonde. Well, some of them were. The ones in Norway were, by and large, of a racial group that gave them height and blonde hair and blue eyes. But the Danes, who were actually some of the more aggressive Vikings, weren't. They were relatively short and dark. So there's no racial characteristic that ties them together any more than there is nationality or anything else. So that's who they were. We know where they lived. There's lots of evidence of where they lived. We know something about where they came from. The area that we're talking about has been inhabited for quite a long time. First settlers would have arrived in the Stone Age, much as they did in Northern Europe, throughout Northern Europe, 4,500 BC to 2000 BC, and they would have stayed through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Now the Iron Age you always think of being antiquity. Well, it is antiquity, but you tend to think that it's been very old antiquity. It's not. The Iron Age is basically when the Romans were around. The Iron Age began in 500 BC, and the birth of the Roman Empire was at the same time. And that was the period of the Vikings. After that, of course, we move into the Middle Ages. The Viking Age ran from 780 AD to 1070. It's a relatively short period of time, 300 years. I mean, well, 300 years is a long time, but life scale, but it was in historical terms fairly short. And the violent acts didn't carry on all through that time period. They began in 780 and they tailed off over the years, where the Vikings began to do different things, as we'll see. Scandinavia was quite well known to both the Romans and the Greeks. Ptolemy, a Greek geographer, used the evidence of Greek sailors who had penetrated right up through the top of northern Europe, and he constructed a map. Now, oddly enough, there are parts of that map you could just about recognise. You can see Britain and Ireland in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see Denmark just about on there. What you can't see is Scandinavia. Well, Scandinavia is there, but he represented it as an island, which it clearly wasn't. But with the conditions of the time, he's got the Baltic there. He's got some of the more important islands in the Baltic. So it was recognisable, and it's interesting that even in the times of the Greeks, you had sailors travelling up to these areas. There's no evidence that they landed, and the Romans certainly didn't. The Romans travelled up there, but they didn't land. Probably they took one look at the Vikings and decided that's too tough even for them. At that age, you've got some indications of what the people were doing. Well, Uslan is a town, it's actually in western Sweden, but it's southeast of Oslo. And these rock carvings, which are there for all to see, show some of the activities that were going on. Up in the bottom left-hand corner, they're hunting. You can see a sledge in one of them, and you can see domestic animals. There's also an awful lot of what looks like killing going on. So even in historical times, they were taking an axe to each other. We even know what these people looked like. This is Tollundman, who was found in a bog in Denmark. And the bog people were essentially killed either for ritual purposes or because they were criminals, we don't know which. And they were tossed in the bogs where the acid in the bog preserved them. So when they were discovered, they're remarkably lifelike. The skin is preserved, the hair is preserved, and as you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, even the clothing is preserved. So we know something of what the people of those times looked like. And this, as it says, is 4th century BC. Bog people were found, first of all, in Denmark, but they're also found in England. We've got a few, I think they're still walking around the streets of Bradford somewhere. And there are some in Ireland. So it was not uncommon to find yourself ending up in a ditch. In Sweden and Norway, they already had a reputation for violence. There's a quotation at the bottom there that said they fought with the ferocity of wild animals and were stronger than the Germans in both body and spirit. That's by a Roman geographer called Jordan, and he was writing about the tribes. These were real tribes that came from this area. And you had the Goths from Gotland, the Cimbri from Jutland in Denmark, the Langobards from Skåne in Sweden, southern Sweden, Burgundians from Bornholm, which is an island in the Baltic, the Rungi from Rogaland in western Norway, and the Svea from Uppland around Uppsala. Now what all of these groups did, basically, was to travel south. There wasn't much going for them in Scandinavia, so they all came down through Europe like hordes, and most of them stayed. They rested, they stayed in parts of central France and Germany, and some of them made it all the way down to Italy. They weren't Vikings, they were just the original, they were just the advanced guard in a sense. Now, Viking activity itself took two forms. As I said, the raiding gradually stopped, but that was their main activity, and that was what they were best known for. That was an enactment, obviously. There were terribly many photographers around at the time. In fact, there wasn't any evidence of what they did, because most of the history of the Vikings was written 200 years after the Viking raid stopped. It was written by the monks. And the monks didn't like the Vikings because the Vikings were the people who came and raided them and upset them. And so they wrote a history of Vikings which was actually probably exaggerated in terms of its awfulness. Then there was the settlement. That was the second activity. It came later, and there is evidence all over Europe and also in America of where the Vikings not only came but stayed. We know essentially how they did it because there are some extraordinary remains of Viking ships. The ship was the primary weapon that they had. This one is the Gokstad ship. They were both used as burial ships. This particular ship was, well, obviously found in a place called Gokstad. And it's perfectly preserved. I mean, I've seen it. It's in a museum in Oslo, in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. It looks as though you could put it to sea and it would go tomorrow. In it, they found a lot of artifacts that were buried with the person whose burial it represented. And the key thing is that it gives you an absolutely perfect idea of what they used. This is another one in the same museum, the Oseberg ship, and same thing. This one's a little cruder, not quite as refined as the first one, but it's a remarkable preservation of the Viking tool. And the ship was the primary weapon that they used. And these ships were good for a number of reasons. First of all, they were watertight, which at the time is interesting, that they could build a ship that delicate that was also perfectly watertight. Secondly, it was very long. It had a very long keel, which means that over the water, it could travel very, very quickly. The speed of a ship is related to the length of the keel. The maximum speed of the ship, sorry, is related to the length of the keel. Don't ask me the formula, but there is one. And these were very, very long ships, and believe it or not, they were called long ships. The other point is that they had a very shallow draft. They didn't need much water to sail it, which is particularly interesting because we think of the Vikings coming in by sea, which of course they did, but as you'll see in a little while, they used the rivers of Europe to penetrate practically the whole of the European landmass. It was an extraordinary feat, and I must confess, when I was researching this, I was surprised at how deep the penetration was and how frequently they made a landfall, they made an encampment. So the ships were the primary weapon. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing. They were sailing ships. They had a sail, as you saw in the original picture of a Viking ship, and that was the primary force of moving them. But they also had oars. They could be rowed as well. And that gave them supplementary power and also, obviously, the ability to travel when there was no wind. These ships, believe it or not, could do 200 kilometers in an average day of sailing. Well, that's not bad. That's a fantastic journey to do in a craft that old of that era. So they were quick. God knows what the oarsmen were like when they finished the day, but it was quite an accomplishment. The other extraordinary thing is that they didn't have much in the way of navigational aids. They had very little. What they did have, however, was phenomenally effective. They did know pretty well most of the time where they were. No GPS, no maps at all. No compasses, nothing. So how did they do it? Well, they had a number of tools. It is thought, sorry, I should preface that. It is thought that they had a number of tools that they could use. The first one in the top left-hand side is a device that they could use. They could point towards the sun. I honestly don't know how, but it gave them the position of the sun at sunrise and sunset. Sorry, they knew where the sun was, obviously, but it gave them an indication of where they were in terms of latitude. They also had a sort of sundial, which they could use the sun to navigate by. They had what do you call it? A wind direction indicator, which told them which way the wind was blowing. And then there was this very, very strange device that there are references to in the historical documents of a crystal. And a crystal that they could use when it was cloudy, when it was foggy, and it would penetrate through, find the sun, and give them information about where the sun lay in relation to where they were. It was thought for many, many years that this was a mythical instrument that somebody had developed, until in about February or March this year, they found that in the bottom left-hand corner. And they found it on an Elizabethan wreck off the island of Albany. And the more they looked at it, they thought this is probably, no certainty obviously, this is probably something derived from the Viking Age. You can see it's a stone circle with a square cut in the middle, and in that square is a crystal. And it had some powers to help them do the navigation. That wasn't all. They were very, very clever with sea law. They could study the currents, they could study the birds, they could study the clouds, and they could use that to give them information about where they were and how they were getting along. They also recorded everything that they did. All the journeys that were made were recorded, and they used that as a sort of preparation for any new trips that they made. So they had a fair amount of information to go by. Nevertheless, when you look at some of the journeys they took, it's not surprising that they were quite accomplished. They had to be quite accomplished navigators. So what did they do? Well, one thing that is clear is that the different Vikings, the Swedes, the Danes and the Norwegians, actually did different things. The Danes occupied basically England. The Swedes occupied to the east. The Swedes came east, down. Whether I can get back up again is another matter. The Swedish Vikings moved east, and they penetrated all the way down to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Swedish Vikings founded Russia. The state that they established when they got to the other side of the Balkans actually became Russia. The Norwegian Vikings moved further north. The Norwegian Vikings were more responsible for the long distance voyages, first of all to Iceland, and then on to Greenland, and then on to America. But all of them got involved in these coastal raids, and as you can see, practically the whole coastline of Europe and North Africa was at one time or another attacked by the Viking raiders. So they were busy little buggers. They were at it most of the time. The Viking Age began in 793. This is I could probably tell you the date if I had time to look it up. It was a recorded event when they landed at Lindisfarne, which is an island off the Northumbrian coast of England, where there was a monastery. And they were after gold, they were after any money that was around, and they were after slaves. Those were the three primary objectives of a Viking raid: gold, money and slaves. And of course the monasteries were a prime target because the monasteries had all, well, they didn't have the slaves obviously, but not that I'm aware of. They certainly had people, and that's what became the slaves. But it was the money that they were going for, and the religious artifacts. So I'll just go back. It's an important date, and it marks the beginning of the Viking era. That was the first ever raid that they made. The first recorded Viking raid on the continent was a town called Noirmoutier. Oh, sorry, I'll get it right. I gave this in French yesterday, for Christ's sake. Noirmoutier. That was in 799, so it was a little bit later. And this is actually the chateau of Noirmoutier, still there. And it's inland from the coast. It's just south of the Loire Valley. No, sorry, just north of the Loire Valley, on the coast. And the original monastery was actually on the coast itself. But subsequently, the monks got so fed up being raided, they were raided quite a few times. But they eventually moved themselves a little bit inland and built some defences. And the defences are still there. They're built into the chateau that is still there today. And I said it was extraordinary how detailed the coverage was, because they used all the main rivers of France and Germany to penetrate Europe. They used the Elbe further up, they used the Seine, they used the Loire, they used the Lot, the Tarn de Garonne down in southwestern France. They used the Rhone. So they covered pretty well the whole of Europe, and they got right into the centre. And all the little dots on the map are evidence of Viking settlements. They weren't really settlements, but they were where remains have been found. It's an extraordinary penetration. As I said, why did they do it? Well, you can see the religious artifacts were extremely valuable, and so they took a hand to that. And then there's a painting there of a slave market, because the slaves were sold in southern Europe. They didn't try and sell them in Scandinavia. Nobody needed them there, not unless you believe the film The Vikings. What they did was transport them down to the south and sold them in the markets, maybe to, what as it says there, Persian traders, but it could have been anywhere in Africa, North Africa. Why were they so successful? They were so successful because these guys did not give a damn about what they did. They were courageous, they were strong, resourceful, but they didn't give a damn. If they saw somebody, they killed them. It's as simple as that. Survival rates from a Viking raid are probably many times worse than the survival rates of any illness you can contract today. They would arrive extremely quickly. The element of surprise was a primary tool for them. They would travel in by stealth in these boats. They would be silent until they landed, and then surprise. Nobody knew they were coming. Well, not at first. Of course, eventually the cry used to go up. They would have people watching to see if the Vikings were around, and when they were seen, there would be a shout from the whole place. It would be like Dad's army, you know, don't panic, don't panic, and they'd be off. So they were quick, they were brutal, they killed it, they had no compunction about killing people, and they were successful. That was the main. Oh, they were cunning as well. Sorry, I should add that. They didn't just do it out of pure pleasure. They were very, very resourceful in terms of how they organised their raids and what they did. After the raiding period, which went on for quite a few years, they also began to think in terms of settlement. Because one of the other reasons that Viking raids were carried out, as I said, it was mainly by younger people rather than the old guys. One of the reasons they did it was that they were looking for land. All of the Scandinavian countries, but particularly Norway, less so Denmark and Sweden, particularly Norway, suffered from a shortage of land. As I said when we started right off, the land that was occupied in Norway, is a very narrow band around the country. There's not much of it available. And in those days you had to be a farmer to survive. You needed a farm. And that was the basis of your life. But obviously after a while the land ran out. So one of the primary pressures for Vikings to do this raiding was to get away and find some land elsewhere. So they were looking for settlements, settlement opportunities. The other reasons were, and I've said earlier on, they were looking for money, but they were also looking for other forms of wealth. And that could be derived from settling and farming the local community. A number of them were doing it to acquire wealth. They were using their skills to acquire not just money to live on, but also capital, which they could invest in, maybe in farms back at home, but also in ships and other sort of activities that could give them a way of living afterwards. There was also a supposition that they were looking for a change of climate. Looking out of the windows today, I think this is probably quite a good day by Norwegian weather standards. So you can imagine what it's like in winter. If you travel up here in winter, it is grisly. It is extremely cold, a lot of snow on the ground. There's not much to do, and so it's a supposition that actually a change in climate, maybe somewhere a little warmer. You can imagine the average Viking saying to his wife, let's go and live somewhere a little warmer. But whether that's true or not, nobody knows. The Vikings didn't leave any of those sorts of records. They also did it for adventure, there's no doubt about that. They probably enjoyed what they did. But the settlements were different. Settlement was a way of moving a part of the population into an area where it could survive. And the primary initial target was the British Isles. So so I'd have to look the date up, but about 900 AD, the first wave of what was called the Great Viking Army landed on the shores of Norfolk and began to penetrate the country. They moved south, but the primary direction was north. And they occupied, as you can see on there, the large yellow part of the map. This was of some concern. The bit that they didn't occupy in the south was basically Wessex, where you had King Alfred of the day, and he was not a little bit annoyed. He was very annoyed. But his resources against the Vikings were not particularly strong. They had continuous period of battles where they tried to throw the Vikings out, and obviously they failed. Now, as you can see from the map, these were basically Danish Vikings. And not surprisingly, that area became known initially by the fact that it gave tribute to the Danes in the form of gold, and that's called the Danegeld, and then it became a Danish area of occupation. The Norwegians were at it as well, as you can see, but they went for Scotland to begin with. And funny thing, nobody tried to throw them out. They settled there quite comfortably. Then they moved down the west coast of England, and after looking at Cumbria, they also settled in Ireland. So the Norwegian Vikings took over that area of eastern counties of Ireland. And Dublin is actually a Viking town. Dublin did not exist until the Vikings arrived, and it was a creation entirely of the Vikings. If you go to Dublin, there is a very good Viking museum there with a lot of the artifacts that they found. And it's it was a settlement for two purposes. One, obviously, for penetrating the country, establishing farms and all the rest of it. It also acted as a base for further areas to raid from. The Dublin Vikings were a particularly nasty group who carried out a lot of those raids in France and further down. So there you have it. You have the Dane law, which is governed by the Danes. In the south you had Wessex, and then the other bits nobody was interested in, King's Wales in Scotland, basically. So the Dane law was established when King Alfred realised he couldn't throw the Vikings out. And so he did a treaty with them, and he said, okay, guys, you can have it, you can stay. So the relationship between Wessex, which was the main power base for the Anglo-Saxons at that time, and the Danes, it sort of stabilised. It wasn't unstable, as you can imagine, but it was established, it was agreed by treaty, and that was it. So the Vikings were there to stay, so they thought. The main Viking town in England, as you probably know, is York. Or as the Vikings called it Jorvik, and the Romans called it something. It was originally a Roman town. The Vikings took it over, and there is a superb museum in York, the Viking Museum, which has not just exhibits, but also models and so on. Place to take the children, basically. What they found there tells us something else about the Vikings. They found a lot of artifacts in York which came very, very long distances. So you have pins from Ireland, okay, that's not so far. Cowrie shells from the Red Sea. Pottery from the Rhineland. Amber from the Baltic, again, not too surprising. But caps, they found remains of clothing made from silk, which in those days came either from the Middle East, well, ultimately it would have come from China, but it could have come via the Middle East. They also found forgeries of